My mother treated me like I was invisible, so I treated her like she was not existing. My mother, Rita, stopped talking to me in January but still expected me to do everything for her. She would communicate through my sister Leslie, telling Leslie to tell me that she needed rides to appointments or money for bills. She'd sit in the same room as me and talk about me to other people like I wasn't there. She'd say things like, "Tell your sister I need her to fix my computer," while I was sitting right next to her. This wasn't because of any fight or disagreement. She just decided one day that I wasn't worth speaking to directly anymore. She told Leslie that talking to me was exhausting, and she didn't have the energy for disappointing conversations. When I asked my mother why she wouldn't speak to me, she looked at Leslie and said, "Tell her she knows what she did." I didn't know what I did, and neither did Leslie, but Mom refused to elaborate. She just kept acting like I was invisible while still expecting me to be available for whatever she needed. She'd leave notes on my door with lists of tasks, but wouldn't acknowledge me when I completed them. She'd eat the dinner I cooked without saying thank you or even looking at me. At family dinners, Mom would talk enthusiastically to everyone else about their lives, but when someone asked about me, she'd say I wouldn't know about that person's life. She'd praise Leslie's job at the bank for 20 minutes, then change the subject when my promotion came up. She hosted a birthday party for Leslie with 50 guests, but didn't even acknowledge my birthday 2 weeks later. She told our aunt that she only had one daughter worth mentioning. The weird part was she still expected me to drive her everywhere because Leslie was too busy. She'd text me grocery lists and doctor appointment times, never asking but just informing me when to show up. She'd get in my car and give directions by pointing, never saying a word during the entire ride. She'd hand me her credit card at the store and walk away expecting me to handle everything. Other family members noticed and asked what was happening between us. Mom would tell them that some relationships just aren't meant to be close, and she was protecting her peace by maintaining distance. She said I knew how to fix things if I really wanted to, but I was too stubborn. Nobody could get her to explain what needed fixing because she'd just say I should know if I cared enough to figure it out. By March, I was done being her silent servant. If Mom wanted to pretend I didn't exist verbally, I decided to actually stop existing for her practically. When she texted me about her doctor's appointment, I didn't respond or show up. She had to take an expensive taxi and was late. She told Leslie to tell me how irresponsible I was, but I just shrugged and said I didn't get any message from Mom since she doesn't talk to me. Mom started leaving more aggressive notes demanding I explain my absence. I threw them away without reading them. She wanted communication to be one way, so I made it 0 way. She'd stand in the kitchen waiting for me to cook dinner, and I'd make food only for myself. She'd have to make her own meals or ask Leslie to bring something. She complained to everyone that I was being petty and childish, but they reminded her that she'd been ignoring me for months, so why should I cook for someone who won't acknowledge me? Next, I started pretending she was invisible too. When relatives asked about her, I'd say I wouldn't know about that person's life. When she sat in the living room, I'd treat the chair as empty and put my feet up on it. When she left things around the house, I'd throw them in the trash because I didn't see anyone's belongings there. She'd frantically search for her reading glasses or phone charger that I'd tossed because invisible people don't own things. The escalation happened at Easter dinner with the whole extended family. Mom was holding court, talking to everyone except me as usual. Our cousin asked Mom about my new job, and Mom said she doesn't discuss people who aren't present. I was sitting directly across from her. That's when I stood up and gave a speech thanking everyone for coming to dinner except Rita, because I didn't see any Rita here. I said it was so nice having family who actually existed in my life and could communicate like adults. Mom turned red and said through Leslie to tell me I was being disrespectful. I looked at Leslie and said I didn't hear anything because nobody was talking to me. Then I served everyone dessert except Mom, saying I only made enough for the people I could see. Mom finally broke and screamed at me directly that I was a spoiled brat who couldn't handle discipline. Everyone stared because she'd been claiming for months that she was maintaining peaceful distance, but here she was yelling. I calmly said I thought you didn't talk to me, so who are you yelling at? The room went completely silent after my question. Nobody moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe for what felt like a full minute. Every single person at that Easter table stared at Rita with their eyes wide and their mouths hanging open. Rita's face turned bright red first, then white, then red again like she couldn't figure out which emotion to settle on. Her jaw clenched and unclenched while she looked around the table at all the relatives watching her. I could see the exact moment she realized what she'd done. She'd spent 3 months refusing to speak to me directly, and now she'd just screamed at me in front of everyone. All her claims about maintaining peaceful distance and protecting her peace just got blown apart by her own anger. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, but nothing came out. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Leslie stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She threw her napkin on the table and looked at both Rita and me with this disgusted expression. She said this whole situation was ridiculous, and she was done being a messenger service between 2 grown women. Her voice came out sharp and loud enough that everyone jumped a little. She grabbed her purse from the back of her chair and announced she was leaving Easter dinner early. She didn't wait for anyone to respond or try to stop her. She just walked straight to the front door and slammed it behind her on the way out. Rita's face went even whiter when Leslie left because now she didn't have her communication go-between anymore. For the first time in months, Rita would have to either talk to me directly or not communicate at all. I watched her realize this and saw something like panic flash across her face before she quickly looked down at her lap. Rita slowly sat back down in her chair and stared at the empty space in front of her, where a dessert plate should have been. Everyone else at the table had a slice of the chocolate cake I'd made sitting in front of them, but Rita just had the bare tablecloth. The relatives started trying to restart conversations around us, but their voices sounded forced and uncomfortable. Someone asked about the weather, and someone else mentioned a movie they'd seen, but nobody was really paying attention to their own words. They were all sneaking looks at Rita and me while pretending not to. I calmly finished serving the last few pieces of cake to my cousins at the far end of the table. Then I sat back down in my chair and cut into my own slice with my fork, like nothing unusual had happened. I took a bite and chewed slowly while Rita sat there with nothing, exactly like I'd planned it. The cake tasted sweet and rich, and I made sure to look like I was really enjoying it. Rita's eyes kept darting to everyone else's plates, and then back to her empty spot. She folded her hands in her lap and sat perfectly still like she was trying to disappear into her chair. After dinner ended, people started gathering their things and saying goodbye. I helped clear plates from the table and carried them into the kitchen. Aunt Arya followed me in while I was scraping leftovers into the trash. She waited until we were alone and then touched my arm to get my attention. She said she had no idea things were this bad between Rita and me. Her voice sounded genuinely shocked and concerned. She told me that Rita had been complaining about me for months at family gatherings and phone calls. But Rita always made it sound like I was the unreasonable one who refused to communicate or spend time with family. Arya said she'd been feeling sorry for Rita this whole time, because Rita painted herself as this hurt mother whose daughter had pulled away for no reason. Arya admitted she'd even judged me a little bit for being so distant and cold to my own mom. Now, seeing what actually happened at dinner, she realized Rita had been lying to everyone about the whole situation. I explained to Arya that Rita stopped talking to me first back in January. I told her how Rita would sit right next to me and tell Leslie to tell me things instead of just speaking to me directly. I described how Rita still expected me to drive her everywhere and cook her meals and help with everything while refusing to acknowledge my existence. Arya's mouth literally fell open while I talked. She kept shaking her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I told her about my birthday that Rita completely ignored and about how Rita would praise Leslie for 20 minutes, but changed the subject when anyone asked about my life. Arya looked genuinely shocked and said that's not the story Rita had been telling the family at all. She said Rita made it sound like I was the one who stopped communicating and refused to help out around the house. Rita told everyone she was just giving me space because I clearly didn't want her in my life. Arya apologized for believing Rita's version without hearing my side first. The next morning, I woke up to find a note taped to my bedroom door. It was written in Rita's handwriting on a small piece of notebook paper. All it said was, "We need to talk," in her neat cursive letters. I pulled the note off the door and crumpled it into a tight ball without even really reading it. I walked to the bathroom and threw it in the trash can under the sink. Invisible people don't leave notes that I can see. If Rita wanted to communicate, she could use her words like a normal person, instead of expecting me to respond to her written demands. I got ready for work and left the house without acknowledging that Rita was sitting in the living room watching me walk past her. She didn't say anything either, so we just existed in the same space without interacting at all. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at the screen and saw Rita's name pop up. This was the first time she'd texted me directly since January instead of going through Leslie. The message said, "Can we please sit down and have a conversation about what happened?" I read it twice and then locked my phone and put it back in my pocket. I didn't reply or acknowledge the text in any way. Rita gave me 3 months of silent treatment, and now she wanted to talk because her system broke down at Easter dinner. I was maintaining the same energy she'd given me for all those weeks. If she could ignore my attempts at communication back in January, then I could ignore hers now. My phone buzzed 2 more times that afternoon with follow-up texts from Rita, but I didn't even look at what they said. That evening, Leslie called me while I was making dinner for myself. She said Rita had been blowing up her phone all day asking her to make me talk to Rita. Leslie sounded tired and frustrated. She told me she meant what she said yesterday about being done as a messenger between us. She wasn't going to pass along any more messages or try to fix things between Rita and me. Leslie said Rita needed to figure out how to communicate like an adult, instead of using other people as go-betweens. She suggested maybe if Rita had to actually face the consequences of her behavior, she might finally understand how hurtful it was. Leslie asked how I was holding up, and I told her I was fine. Better than fine, actually, because I wasn't driving Rita around or cooking her meals or doing her errands anymore. Leslie laughed a little and said she was glad I was standing up for myself even if the whole situation was messy. 3 days after Easter, I was in the kitchen making coffee when Rita walked in. She stood in the doorway and looked right at me. Her voice came out soft and shaky when she said, "Please, can we just talk about this?" It was the first time she'd spoken directly to me since January, and hearing her voice felt strange after months of silence. I looked right through her like she wasn't standing there at all. I poured my coffee and added cream and sugar while she waited for me to respond. Then I walked past her without making eye contact or acknowledging that she'd said anything. I heard her voice crack with frustration behind me as she said my name again, but I just kept walking to my room. Her footsteps followed me down the hallway, but I closed my bedroom door before she could say anything else. Later that night, I was watching a show on TV in the living room when Rita came in and stood directly in front of the screen. She blocked my view completely and crossed her arms over her chest. She demanded that I acknowledge her and stop acting like she didn't exist. Her voice sounded angry but also desperate. I picked up my laptop from the coffee table and stood up from the couch. I walked around her without looking at her face and headed toward my bedroom. She was still talking as I left the room, saying things about how childish I was being and how we needed to work this out. I went into my room and locked the door behind me while her voice continued in the living room talking to empty air. I put my headphones on and opened my laptop to finish my show in peace. The next few days, I kept my routine simple. I went to work, came home, made dinner for myself, and stayed in my room. Rita tried different approaches, but I walked past every attempt like she wasn't standing there. I heard her voice sometimes when I was in another room, but I never responded or looked her way. She left notes on the kitchen counter and taped them to my bathroom mirror, but I collected them all without reading a single word. Every morning there would be more notes, and every evening I'd gather them up and drop them in her room. The pile on her nightstand grew taller each day. I knew she was watching me move through the house, and I knew she could see me throw away her attempts at communication, but that was her problem to solve. She spent 3 months pretending I didn't exist, and now she was getting the exact same treatment back. Thursday evening, I got home from work around 6 and walked into the kitchen to find Rita sitting at the table with Aunt Aria. They both looked up when I came in, and I could tell immediately this was planned. Aria opened her mouth to say something, but I just walked past them to the fridge and grabbed an apple and a yogurt. I didn't make eye contact with either of them. I could feel them watching me as I closed the fridge and headed toward the hallway. Aria called my name behind me, but I kept walking straight to my room and closed the door. I heard their voices continue in the kitchen, muffled through the walls, but I put my headphones on and ate my snack while scrolling through my phone. About an hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from Aria. She said she tried to help Rita talk to me, but she realized now that Rita needed to take the first real step toward fixing this. She wrote that watching me ignore Rita the same way Rita ignored me made her finally understand how hurtful Rita's behavior actually was. I read the message twice and then put my phone down without responding. Over the next week, Rita's notes got more desperate. She wrote that she was sorry and wanted to explain everything. She left sticky notes on my bedroom door saying, "Please just talk to me." She wrote longer letters on notebook paper describing how much she missed having a relationship with me. Every single note went straight into the pile on her bed. I didn't read them because I still didn't see any Rita in this house who could leave notes for me. If she wanted to communicate, she could use her actual voice like an adult instead of hiding behind pieces of paper. The pile on her nightstand got so tall it started falling over onto her pillow. I'd walk past her room and see all those unread notes scattered across her bed and keep moving. Saturday afternoon, Leslie texted saying she was coming over for dinner. I started cooking pasta with chicken and vegetables around 5. I set 2 places at the table with plates and silverware and glasses. Rita appeared in the doorway while I was draining the pasta. She stood there watching me cook, and I could see her out of the corner of my eye, but I didn't acknowledge her presence. I plated food for Leslie and myself and carried both plates to the table. I sat down in my usual spot and left the other plate across from me for Leslie. Rita stayed in the doorway. Leslie arrived 20 minutes later and sat down at her place. We started eating and talking about her week at the bank. Rita moved from the doorway to a chair at the end of the table, but I'd only set 2 places, so there was no plate or silverware for her. She sat there watching us eat. About halfway through dinner, Rita's voice cracked and she started crying. She said through her tears that she was sorry for shutting me out. Her hands were shaking on the table and her face was red. I looked at Leslie and took another bite of my pasta. I said it was nice when people who exist can express their feelings. Then I asked Leslie about her plans for next weekend. Leslie glanced at Rita and then back at me, but she answered my question. We finished our dinner while Rita cried quietly at the end of the table. When we were done eating, I cleared both plates and loaded the dishwasher. Rita got up and went to her room. I could hear her door close down the hallway. Leslie pulled me aside in the kitchen after Rita left. She said she thought I'd made my point and maybe I should hear Rita out. I reminded Leslie that she was the one who said she was done being a messenger. I told her this was between Rita and me to figure out and she didn't need to get involved. Leslie said she knew that, but watching Rita break down was hard to see. I said watching Rita ignore me for 3 months was also hard to see, but nobody seemed concerned about that at the time. Leslie nodded and said she understood. She hugged me before she left and told me to take care of myself. That night around 10, I was in my room reading when someone knocked on my door. Rita's voice came through saying she knew she hurt me and wanted to make it right. She knocked again and said my name. I reached over and turned up my music loud enough to drown out her voice. I kept reading my book while she knocked a few more times. Eventually, the knocking stopped and I heard her footsteps walk away down the hall. I turned my music back down and continued reading. She was getting the same silent treatment she'd perfected over 3 months. If she couldn't handle it for a few weeks, then maybe she'd finally understand how it felt. Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was at work. It was Nathan, my uncle. I stepped outside to take the call. He said Rita had reached out to him in tears asking for advice on how to fix things with me. His voice sounded tired, like he'd been dealing with this for a while. He asked what it would take for me to be willing to listen to Rita's apology. I told him Rita needed to give me a real explanation for why she stopped talking to me in the first place. I explained that saying "you know what you did" isn't an explanation when I genuinely don't know what I supposedly did wrong. I said I needed to understand what happened before I could even think about moving forward. Nathan was quiet for a second, and then he said that was fair. Nathan called me back the next day. He said he asked Rita that exact question about what I did wrong. She got defensive and changed the subject completely. He admitted he was starting to think Rita didn't actually have a good reason, and that's why she wouldn't explain it. He said it seemed like Rita decided to be mad about something, and then couldn't back down even when she realized she was wrong. I thanked Nathan for trying and told him I appreciated him being honest with me. He said he'd keep working on Rita, but he couldn't make any promises. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going back inside to finish my shift. At least now I knew I wasn't crazy for not understanding what I'd done wrong. 2 weeks crawled by after Easter. Rita kept her distance, but I could feel her watching me around the house. She'd start to say something, then stop herself. She'd leave a room when I entered. She'd cook her own meals in silence while I made mine. The whole house felt heavy with all the things nobody was saying. I came home from work one Tuesday and found an envelope on my pillow. My name was written on the front in Rita's handwriting. I sat on my bed and turned it over in my hands for a minute before opening it. Inside were 3 pages of Rita's careful cursive writing. I started reading and had to stop after the first paragraph to catch my breath. Rita wrote that she'd been feeling like I was pulling away from the family for months before January. She said it hurt watching me get busier with work and friends while spending less time at home. She wrote that instead of talking to me about feeling left out, she decided to protect herself by withdrawing first. She said she thought if she stopped reaching out to me, then it wouldn't hurt as much when I eventually stopped caring about her completely. The letter went on for 2 more pages. Rita admitted her response was way out of line compared to whatever distance she thought existed between us. She wrote that she knew pushing me away while still expecting me to drive her places and help with things was unfair and manipulative. She said she'd been treating me like a servant instead of a daughter, and she was ashamed of that. She wrote that the silent treatment was her trying to punish me for something I didn't even know I was doing wrong. She ended the letter by saying she understood if I couldn't forgive her, but she wanted me to know the truth about why it happened. I read the whole thing 3 times. Each time I felt something crack inside my chest where all my anger had been sitting for months. This was the first time Rita actually took responsibility, instead of blaming me or making excuses or saying I should have known better. She spelled out exactly what she did and why she did it. She admitted it was wrong. But I still wasn't ready to just forgive her and act like the last 4 months never happened. Months of being invisible don't disappear because of 1 letter. I folded the pages and put them back in the envelope. Then I got out my own notebook and started writing. I wrote about how deeply it hurt to be was ignored by my own mother, while still being expected to serve her needs like some kind of employee. I described coming home every day not knowing if she'd acknowledge me or pretend I didn't exist. I wrote about my birthday, and how she threw Leslie a huge party, but couldn't even say happy birthday to me 2 weeks later. I wrote about sitting at family dinners while she talked enthusiastically to everyone except me. I wrote about all the little moments that made me feel worthless and invisible. I wrote about driving her to appointments in complete silence and wondering what I'd done to deserve this treatment. I filled 4 pages front and back before I ran out of things to say. I folded my letter and put it in an envelope with Rita's name on it. Then I walked down the hall to her room and left it on her bed where she'd find it. My hands were shaking when I walked back to my room. I closed my door and sat on my bed wondering what would happen next. Part of me felt good about finally telling her exactly how her actions affected me. Part of me felt scared about what she'd say when she read it. I tried to read a book but couldn't focus on the words. I kept listening for sounds from her room. Around 7 that evening, I heard Rita's door open and close. Then I heard crying. Not loud sobbing, but quiet crying that sounded like she was trying to muffle it. The sound made my stomach twist. I felt satisfied that she finally understood how much she hurt me. But I also felt guilty for causing her pain, even though she'd caused me plenty of pain first. I sat there listening to her cry and feeling both things at once. The crying went on for maybe 20 minutes before it got quiet again. I heard her blow her nose. Then nothing. I went to bed early that night but couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Rita reading my letter and wondering if I'd been too harsh. But then I'd remember her ignoring me for months, and I'd think no, she needed to hear all of that. I finally fell asleep around midnight. The next morning, someone knocked on my door. Rita's voice came through asking if she could please come in and talk. I sat up in bed and stared at the door for a second. She was speaking directly to me for the first time in months, except for when she yelled at Easter. I got up and opened the door. Rita stood there holding my letter in one hand. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. Tears were running down her face. She asked out loud if she could please come in and talk face to face. Her voice cracked on the word please. I stepped aside without saying anything and she walked into my room. We both sat down on my bed about a foot apart. The silence felt thick and awkward. Rita kept looking at the letter in her hands, then at me, then back at the letter. Finally, she said she had no idea her birthday snub hurt me that badly. She said reading about it in my letter made her ashamed of how cruel she was. She said she'd been so focused on her own hurt feelings that she didn't think about what her actions were doing to me. She said she was sorry. Rita took a deep breath and kept talking. She said she felt like I was always busy with work and friends and never made time for family anymore. She said watching me build this independent life made her jealous because she didn't have that kind of freedom. She admitted she was jealous of my independence and dealt with it in the worst possible way by punishing me with silence. She said instead of being proud of me for building a good life, she resented me for not needing her as much as I used to. She said that resentment turned into this twisted way of trying to make me need her again by refusing to talk to me, but still expecting me to help her. She said she knew that didn't make sense, but that's what was going through her head at the time. I let her finish talking before I said anything. Then I told her she never communicated feeling neglected or left out. I said she just suddenly cut me off one day and expected me to read her mind about what was wrong. I explained that I can't fix problems I don't know exist, and her silent treatment taught me nothing except that she was willing to hurt me. I told her if she'd just said she missed spending time with me, we could have figured something out. Instead, she chose to make me feel invisible and worthless for months. I said I spent weeks trying to figure out what I did wrong and nobody could tell me because there was nothing specific I did. I told her the not knowing was almost worse than the silent treatment itself because I kept blaming myself for something I couldn't identify. Rita nodded and more tears ran down her face. She said I was completely right and her approach was totally wrong. She said she should have just told me she missed spending time with me instead of playing these mind games. She admitted she was too proud to be vulnerable and tell me she felt left out. She said it felt easier to be cold and distant than to admit she needed more attention from me. She said she thought if she acted like she didn't care, then it wouldn't hurt if I didn't care either. But that backfired because I did care, and her silence hurt me deeply. And then I stopped caring because why would I keep caring about someone who treats me like I don't exist? She said she created the exact situation she was trying to avoid, and she had nobody to blame but herself. We kept talking, and Rita opened up about feeling left behind while I built my own life. She said watching me become independent made her scared of losing me completely, so she pushed me away first to protect herself from that pain. I explained that pushing me away actually created the exact loss she feared, and if she'd just told me she wanted more quality time together, I would have made that happen. Rita wiped her eyes and admitted she never learned how to ask for what she needed without making it into a test or punishment. She said her own mother did the same thing, making people guess what was wrong instead of just saying it directly. I told her I wasn't interested in guessing games or mind reading, and if we were going to fix this, she needed to use actual words to tell me when something bothered her. Rita agreed and said she'd try her best to communicate directly from now on. I said trying wasn't good enough, and she needed to commit to it completely, because I wasn't going through another silent treatment ever again. Rita looked me in the eye and promised she would never shut me out like that again, and if she felt hurt or neglected, she'd tell me right away, instead of punishing me. I told her I'd hold her to that promise, and if she broke it, I was done for good this time. She nodded and said she understood the stakes and wouldn't waste this second chance. Then I explained that even though we were talking again, I needed time to trust her again because 4 months of being treated like I was invisible did serious damage. Rita said she got it and wouldn't rush me or expect everything to go back to normal right away. I appreciated that she seemed to actually understand the consequences of her actions instead of just making excuses. We agreed to rebuild our relationship slowly and carefully, instead of pretending the whole thing never happened. Rita suggested we start having weekly dinners together, just the two of us, where we could practice communicating without other people around. I thought that was a good idea and said we could start next week. She asked if Wednesday worked for me and I said sure, I'd come home by 6. Rita smiled for the first time since she came into my room and thanked me for giving her another chance. I didn't smile back because I wasn't ready to act like everything was fine, but I nodded to show I heard her. 3 days later on Wednesday evening, Rita and I sat down for our first planned dinner together. She'd made chicken and vegetables, which I knew was an effort because she usually didn't cook much anymore. I sat across from her at the kitchen table and we both just stared at our plates for a minute without saying anything. The silence felt heavy and awkward, nothing like the comfortable quiet we used to share before all this started. Rita finally asked how work was going, and I gave her a basic update about a project I was working on. She actually listened to my whole answer instead of interrupting or changing the subject like she used to do. I asked about her book club, and she told me about the novel they were reading and what she thought of it. We kept the conversation safe and surface level, both of us being careful not to say anything that might start an argument. Every few minutes, there'd be a long pause where neither of us knew what to say next. Rita would take a bite of food, and I'd do the same. Then we'd try to think of another neutral topic. She asked if I needed anything for my room, and I said no, everything was fine. I asked if she needed help with anything around the house, and she said Leslie had already taken care of the things that needed doing. Another long silence followed where we both pretended to focus on eating. Rita mentioned that the weather was supposed to be nice this weekend, and maybe we could go to the farmer's market together. I said maybe. I'd have to check my schedule first. She nodded and didn't push, which I appreciated because the old Rita would have gotten offended that I didn't immediately say yes. We finished eating, and I helped her clear the table without being asked. Rita thanked me for helping and for showing up tonight. I said I told her I would, so of course I showed up. She said she knew I keep my word, but she still appreciated it after everything that happened. I just nodded because I didn't know what else to say to that. The following week, Leslie came over to drop off some mail that got sent to her place by mistake. She walked into the kitchen and stopped dead when she saw Rita and me sitting at the table having coffee together. Her mouth literally fell open, and she looked back and forth between us like she was seeing ghosts. Rita smiled at her and offered her some coffee, but Leslie just stood there staring. Finally, Leslie said she couldn't believe we were actually talking to each other like normal people. I shrugged and said we were working on it. Leslie sat down at the table with us and said she was glad we were talking again, but we both needed to be careful not to fall back into the same toxic patterns that caused this mess. Rita looked a little offended but didn't argue, which showed she was actually trying to change. Leslie turned to me and said I also needed to make sure I didn't hold on to resentment and use it as a weapon later. I told Leslie I wasn't planning to throw the silent treatment in Rita's face every time we disagreed, but I also wasn't going to pretend it never happened. Leslie said that was fair and she just wanted both of us to actually deal with our issues instead of playing games. Rita agreed and said she'd already promised me she'd never shut me out again. Leslie looked at Rita seriously and said she hoped that was true because she was done being a messenger between us. She said if Rita ever tried to use her to communicate with me again, she'd refuse and walk away. Rita apologized to Leslie right then for putting her in that position for so long. Leslie accepted the apology but said Rita needed to prove through her actions that she meant it. I could tell Leslie was still skeptical about whether Rita would really change, and honestly, I was too. Later that week, Rita and I sat down and made a list of ground rules for our relationship going forward. The first rule was no silent treatments ever again, no matter how mad either of us got at the other. Rita wrote it down on a piece of paper and we both signed it like a contract. The second rule was no communicating through Leslie or anyone else. We had to talk directly to each other about problems. Rita agreed and said she understood why that was important. The third rule was if either of us had a problem with the other, we had to bring it up within 24 hours instead of letting it build up. I said this was the most important one because Rita's habit of staying quiet about issues until she exploded was what started this whole thing. Rita admitted I was right and promised she'd speak up right away if something bothered her. We also agreed that we'd have our weekly dinners every Wednesday and use that time to check in with each other about how things were going. Rita suggested we could also text each other during the week just to stay connected. Nothing heavy, just normal stuff. I said that was fine as long as she actually responded to my texts instead of ignoring them like she used to do sometimes. Rita looked embarrassed and apologized for that old habit. She said she'd make an effort to reply within a few hours unless she was really busy. I told her I'd do the same and we'd both try to be better about staying in touch. We hung the list of rules on the refrigerator so we'd both see it every day and remember what we committed to. Rita said having it visible would help keep her accountable, and I agreed it would remind both of us to stick to what we promised. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing Rita making real efforts to change how she acted. She'd ask me about my day when I got home from work and actually remember the details I told her. A few days later, she'd bring up something I mentioned and ask how it turned out, which showed she was paying attention. She started texting me during the day with random thoughts or funny things she saw, just staying connected like we agreed. When I cooked dinner, she'd thank me out loud instead of just eating silently like she used to. She'd offer to help with dishes or other chores without me having to ask. Sometimes it still felt uncomfortable because we were both being so careful around each other, but it also felt more real than our relationship ever was before. Rita wasn't just going through the motions, she was genuinely trying to be present and engaged. I caught myself almost enjoying our Wednesday dinners instead of dreading them. We'd actually laugh sometimes at stories we told each other, and the silences between topics didn't feel as heavy anymore. Rita asked my opinion on things and listened to my answers instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. I noticed I was starting to relax around her again. Not completely, but more than I had in months. The constant tension in my shoulders when I was near her started to ease up a little bit. I still didn't fully trust her yet because 4 months of damage doesn't heal in a few weeks, but I could see she was putting in the work. One evening, Rita called Leslie and asked her to come over for dinner. When Leslie arrived, Rita sat her down at the kitchen table and apologized for putting her in the middle of our conflict for all those months. She said it wasn't fair to make Leslie carry messages back and forth and deal with both of us complaining about each other. Rita admitted she used Leslie as a shield so she wouldn't have to face me directly, and that was wrong. Leslie listened quietly, and when Rita finished, she said she appreciated the apology. But then Leslie told Rita very clearly that she would never agree to be a messenger again, and both Rita and I needed to respect that boundary going forward. She said if either of us tried to use her that way again, she'd shut it down immediately and refuse to participate. Rita promised she understood and wouldn't put Leslie in that position again. I added that I also promised not to use Leslie as a go-between, and we'd handle our issues directly from now on. Leslie looked relieved and said she was glad we were both taking responsibility. She admitted the whole situation had been incredibly stressful for her, and she'd felt trapped between us. Rita apologized again and said she never meant to stress Leslie out like that. Leslie said she knew Rita didn't do it on purpose, but the impact was still real. We all agreed to be more mindful of how our conflicts affected the people around us. The conversation felt good, like we were actually dealing with things honestly instead of sweeping them under the rug. At the next family gathering a few weeks later, we all met at Nathan's house for a barbecue. I was helping set up food on the patio table when Rita came over and started arranging plates next to me. We were working together naturally without any tension, which felt strange after months of avoiding each other. Rita handed me napkins and I put them in the holders while she grabbed utensils from the kitchen. We moved around each other smoothly like we used to before everything went wrong. I noticed several relatives watching us with surprised expressions. Rita's sister Aria came over and commented on how much better Rita and I seemed to be getting along. She said it was nice to see us working together again instead of staying on opposite sides of the room. Rita surprised me by speaking up and telling Aria that she'd created the whole problem between us, and I had every right to respond the way I did. She said the silent treatment was cruel, and she was ashamed of how she acted. Aria looked shocked because Rita never admitted being wrong about anything, especially not in front of family. Rita continued and said she was grateful I stood up to her because it forced her to look at her own behavior and make real changes. I didn't say anything, but I appreciated that Rita was taking public responsibility instead of trying to save face. Several other relatives overheard and nodded approvingly. Rita's willingness to admit fault in front of everyone showed she was serious about changing, not just putting on an act when we were alone. Later during the barbecue, my cousin Javier pulled me aside near the fence where we could talk privately. He said he was really impressed that I stood up to Rita the way I did at Easter dinner. I asked what he meant, and he said everyone in the family knew Rita could be difficult, but nobody ever called her out on it. Javier admitted people had been afraid to challenge Rita's passive-aggressive behavior for years because she'd just shut them out or make their lives miserable. He said watching me mirror her behavior back at her was brilliant because it made her experience what she'd been doing to others. I told Javier I wasn't trying to be brilliant. I was just tired of being treated like I didn't exist. He nodded and said whatever my motivation was, it worked, and Rita seemed genuinely different now. Javier said his own mother had similar communication problems, and he wished someone had stood up to her years ago before the damage got too deep. He told me not to let Rita slide back into old habits and to keep holding her accountable. I promised I would and said I had no intention of going through that again. Javier clapped me on the shoulder and said he respected how I handled the whole situation. We walked back to join the others, and I felt good knowing that other family members recognized what I'd been dealing with and supported how I responded to it. I walked back to join the others and felt good knowing that other family members recognized what I'd been dealing with and supported how I responded to it. Rita was standing near the grill talking to Nathan about something when she turned and caught my eye. She looked away quickly, and I could tell from her face that she'd heard at least part of what Javier said to me. The rest of the barbecue continued normally with people eating and chatting in small groups around the backyard. I helped clean up plates and cups while Rita stayed mostly quiet near the patio table. After most people had left and only close family remained, Rita walked over to where I was folding up chairs. She asked if we could talk for a minute, and I nodded, setting down the chair I was holding. We moved to a quieter corner of the yard near the fence where Nathan's garden grew along the property line. Rita looked uncomfortable and kept picking at a loose thread on her sleeve before she finally started talking. She said she'd overheard what Javier told me about how her communication style affected multiple people in the family, not just me. Rita admitted she'd been thinking a lot since Easter about how she handles conflict, and realizes now that shutting people out is something she does with everyone when she gets upset or feels hurt. She told me she's been doing this her whole life and never really thought about how damaging it was until I forced her to experience it herself. Rita said she's thinking seriously about talking to a therapist because she doesn't want to keep repeating these patterns with the people she cares about. I was surprised she brought up therapy on her own without me suggesting it first. I told her I thought that was a really good idea and that talking to someone professional could help her understand why she does this and give her better tools for handling her feelings. Rita looked relieved that I wasn't being negative about the therapy suggestion and said she wasn't sure where to start finding someone. I offered to help her research therapists if she wanted, and she seemed genuinely surprised by my willingness to support her. She accepted the offer, and we agreed to spend some time that week looking into options together. That evening after we both got home, Rita came to my room with her laptop, and we sat on my bed searching for therapists in our area who specialized in family relationships and communication issues. We read through profiles and reviews for almost 2 hours, discussing which ones seemed like they might be a good fit. Rita made notes about a few therapists she wanted to call for initial consultations, and thanked me for helping her with the search. Over the next few weeks, Rita started seeing a therapist named Dr. Smith, who had good reviews and specialized in family dynamics. After her first few sessions, Rita began sharing small things she was learning with me. She'd come home from appointments and tell me about concepts Dr. Smith introduced, or questions that made her think differently about her behavior. One evening while we were making dinner together, Rita explained that Dr. Smith had asked about her own childhood and family relationships. Rita told me that her mother, my grandmother, had used the silent treatment as a form of punishment throughout Rita's entire childhood. If Rita did something wrong or disappointed her mother, she'd be ignored for days or even weeks until she figured out how to apologize properly. Rita said she never realized until therapy that she'd unconsciously copied that exact pattern with me. Hearing about Rita's background helped me understand where her behavior came from, even though I still maintained it didn't excuse what she did to me. Rita agreed completely and said Dr. Smith was helping her work on breaking these generational patterns of poor communication. She said just because something was done to her doesn't mean it was okay for her to do it to others. Rita seemed genuinely committed to changing, appreciated that she was taking real steps instead of just apologizing and expecting everything to go back to normal. 2 months after our Easter confrontation, Rita and I had dinner together that felt completely different from all our previous attempts. We were both relaxed and laughing naturally while sharing stories about our days. Rita asked me about a project at work, and actually listened to my full explanation without interrupting or changing the subject. I told her about a funny thing that happened with a coworker, and she laughed genuinely instead of giving me the fake smile she used to do. We spent almost 2 hours at the table just talking and enjoying each other's company in a way that felt easy and comfortable. It struck me that we weren't trying to recreate what we had before all this happened. We were building something completely new and possibly better. A few weeks later, Rita brought up my upcoming birthday, which was still 3 months away. She asked me what I wanted to do and how I'd like to celebrate this year. I could tell she was overcompensating for last year when she completely was ignored my birthday, but I appreciated that she was making such an obvious effort to show she valued me. I told her I didn't need anything big, maybe just dinner with close family, and she seemed relieved that I wasn't asking for some huge party. Rita said she wanted to make sure this birthday was special, and asked me to let her know if I thought of anything specific I wanted. At our next family dinner at Leslie's apartment, my sister commented on how different our gatherings felt now compared to a few months ago. Leslie said these dinners were actually enjoyable instead of being tense competitions for Mom's attention, where everyone walked on eggshells. She told Rita and me that watching us work through our issues had inspired her to set better boundaries in her own relationships, both at work and in her personal life. Leslie said she used to let people treat her poorly because she was afraid of conflict, but seeing me stand up to Rita showed her that sometimes confrontation is necessary for healthy relationships. Rita looked proud when Leslie said that, even though it meant acknowledging again how badly she'd handled things with me. During one of her therapy sessions, Rita shared something with Dr. Smith that she later told me about. She said her therapist helped her realize that her fear of abandonment made her push people away before they could leave her first. Rita explained that she'd always been terrified of people she loved deciding she wasn't worth staying for, so she'd create distance and rejection before they had the chance to reject her. Rita apologized again for projecting all her anxiety onto me and punishing me for imagined slights that were really just her own insecurities. Hearing this explanation helped me understand her behavior on a deeper level, even though it still hurt to think about how invisible she made me feel. I decided to share my own feelings more openly with Rita during one of our dinners. I told her that her silent treatment made me feel completely invisible and worthless, like I didn't matter enough to even acknowledge. I explained that it triggered my own insecurities about not being good enough or important enough to deserve basic respect and communication. Rita listened without interrupting, and I could see tears in her eyes as I described specific moments that hurt me the most. We both acknowledged that we'd hurt each other deeply during those months, and that healing would take continued effort from both of us. Rita said she was committed to doing better, and I told her I was too, that I wanted us to have a real relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. 3 months after Easter, Rita and I went shopping together at the mall for some new clothes. We tried on ridiculous outfits in the dressing rooms and took silly pictures that made us both laugh until our stomachs hurt. Rita put on a bright purple hat with a huge feather and modeled it dramatically while I cracked up. I tried on a jacket that was 3 sizes too big and pretended to be a fashion model walking down a runway. We spent hours in different stores just having fun together without any tension or awkwardness between us. It was the first time in years that spending time with Rita felt easy, instead of like some obligation I had to fulfill. Walking through the mall with shopping bags and still giggling about the outfits we'd tried on, I realized our relationship had fundamentally changed for the better. Rita started thanking me out loud for everything I did, which felt weird at first after months of being invisible. When I helped her carry groceries from the car, she turned to me and said, "Thank you so much for helping me with these bags." I nodded and kept walking because I didn't know what else to do with this new version of her who actually acknowledged my existence. The next week, when I fixed her computer that kept freezing, she came into my room specifically to tell me she really appreciated me taking the time to solve her tech problems. I realized I was helping her more often now that she made me feel like my efforts mattered instead of treating me like an unpaid servant. Our relationship was shifting into something more balanced, where we both gave and received, instead of her just taking while I gave everything. Leslie invited the whole family to a barbecue at her place the following Saturday. I watched Rita move through the crowd of relatives, talking to everyone with actual warmth instead of her usual passive-aggressive comments. She asked Nathan about his new job and listened to his whole answer without interrupting or changing the subject. When Arya mentioned her daughter's graduation, Rita congratulated her enthusiastically and asked questions about the ceremony. I stood by the grill flipping burgers and noticed how different Rita's communication style had become in just a few months. She was making real eye contact with people and responding to what they said, instead of waiting for her turn to talk about herself. The change wasn't just with me. It was showing up in all her relationships with family members who used to avoid her, because conversations felt like battles. After the barbecue, when most people had left, Rita pulled me aside near Leslie's garden. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she was proud of me for standing up to her even though it hurt like crazy at the time. Rita explained that nobody else in her life had ever held her accountable for her behavior, because they were all too afraid of her reactions. She admitted that I taught her something important about consequences, and how treating people badly means they stop wanting to be around you. Rita said she needed someone to show her how painful her silent treatment actually felt, and I was brave enough to mirror it back to her. I felt my throat get tight because this was the most honest conversation we'd ever had about what happened between us. I told Rita that mirroring her behavior back to her was partly about revenge, but also the only way I could think of to make her understand. I explained that talking to her about how much she hurt me didn't work because she just ignored me more, so I had to show her what being invisible felt like from the other side. Rita grabbed my hand and said she gets it now in a way she never could have without actually experiencing the silent treatment herself. She admitted that when I started treating her like she didn't exist, it made her feel worthless and small, which was exactly how she'd made me feel for months. We stood there in Leslie's backyard crying together because we both finally understood how badly we'd hurt each other and how much work it took to fix what we broke. 2 weeks later, Leslie hosted a dinner party with just our immediate family and a few close friends. She stood up with her wine glass and made a toast to family members who are brave enough to have difficult conversations instead of letting problems fester. Leslie looked directly at Rita and me and said she was grateful we both chose honesty over comfortable silence, even though it was messy and painful. She explained that watching us work through our issues inspired her to set better boundaries in her own life and stop accepting bad treatment from people. Rita raised her glass toward me and I raised mine back, both of us smiling through tears because we knew how hard we'd fought to get to this moment of mutual respect. Rita suggested we start meeting for coffee every week to check in with each other about how we're feeling and address any small issues before they become big problems. We picked Tuesday mornings at the coffee shop near her house and made it a standing date on both our calendars. That first Tuesday, we sat across from each other with our lattes, and Rita asked how I was really doing, not just the surface-level fine that people usually say. I told her about stress at work, and she listened without trying to fix everything or make it about herself. Then she shared that therapy was bringing up hard memories from her childhood, and she was learning why she pushed people away. These Tuesday coffee dates quickly became my favorite part of the week, because Rita and I were finally building something real, instead of just going through the motions of being family. 4 months after our Easter confrontation, Rita told me over coffee that she was grateful I didn't just accept her silent treatment and keep enabling her bad behavior. She said I forced her to grow in ways she desperately needed, but would never have chosen on her own. Rita explained that if I'd kept being her invisible servant, she would have continued treating people terribly, and wondering why nobody wanted to be close to her. She admitted that my decision to mirror her behavior was the wake-up call she needed to see how toxic she'd become. I stirred my coffee and felt proud of myself for standing my ground even when it would have been easier to just take whatever treatment she gave me. I realized I'd grown too through this whole mess, learning to set firm boundaries and demand the respect I deserve instead of accepting whatever scraps people throw my way. Our conflict taught me that I'm worth more than being someone's invisible servant, who does everything while getting nothing back. I told Rita that before all this happened, I would have let anyone treat me badly, because I was too scared of confrontation and losing relationships. Now I know that a relationship where someone treats me like garbage isn't worth keeping, even if that person is my own mother. Rita nodded and said she was teaching me that lesson without meaning to, and she was glad something good came from her terrible behavior. Rita and I still have disagreements sometimes, but we handle them completely differently now. When I get annoyed that she's being pushy about something, I tell her right away, instead of letting resentment build up for weeks. When Rita feels like I'm not making enough time for family, she says so directly instead of punishing me with silence. Last week we had a small fight about me canceling our coffee date because of a work emergency, but we talked it through that same evening instead of letting it turn into a bigger problem. Our relationship isn't perfect and probably never will be, but it's honest and respectful in a way it never was before. We both know we can say what we're really thinking without the other person shutting down or disappearing. Looking back on the whole situation now, I'm glad I stood my ground even though it was painful for both of us at the time. Rita and I have a real relationship now based on mutual respect and actual communication, which is something we never had before when she was just my mother who expected things from me. We're more like two adults who genuinely care about each other and work to maintain a healthy connection. I don't regret treating Rita like she was invisible because it was the only thing that made her understand how badly she was hurting me. Sometimes people need to experience their own behavior reflected back at them before they can see how wrong it is. Rita needed to feel invisible to understand why I couldn't keep living that way, and I needed to stand up for myself to learn that I deserve better treatment from everyone in my life, including family.